This video will dive into the life and purported mental illness of Lady Caroline Lamb, one of the lovers of Lord Byron and an accomplished author in her own right. Lady Caroline Lamb, or Caro, which was a nickname she gave herself, was curious about everything and constantly asked why in her youth. When she received an answer, she asked another question about the answer that had just been given. Her search for knowledge drove her family, the noble Ponsonby family, to distraction. Since arriving in England, from Italy, Caroline had become stubborn, perverse, and argumentative, and on occasions violent. Lady Spencer consulted Dr. Warren, who recommended that she should be isolated from her brothers and cousins. He believed if she could no longer show off or turn the schoolroom into a battlefield, she would become bored and behave properly. When Caroline was naughty, she was ignored, and when she was disobedient, she was dosed with sal volatile or was spoken to so sharply she was reduced to tears. Her good conduct was rewarded by being allowed to spend days with her brothers riding horses in Cavendish Square, or with her cousins at Devonshire House. Just when everything seemed to be going well, Caroline fell from grace by quizzing Lady Spencer on religion. Lady Spencer was her grandmother. Her punishment was to sit in a cupboard with Mary the governess until it was time to go to bed with a dose of laudanum laced with lavender oil. Laudanum was readily available in those days. For more about laudanum and its uses, you can check out my video on Branwell Bronte. But overdoses of laudanum would cause euphoria and depression, as well as constipation. We see Caro getting addicted to laudanum in her 40s, and so it's interesting that she was exposed to it at a very young age. As a small child, Caro was considered delicate and for her health spent much time in the country. She traveled with her mother and other family to Italy, where she made a recovery from an illness caused by worms that nearly ended her life. After returning with her mother to England, she rejoined a lively collection of children who lived at Devonshire House and Roehampton. Her cousins, the children of William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire, by his first marriage to Lady Georgiana Spencer, 3 children. Lady Georgiana, known as Little G, Lady Harriet Cavendish, known as Harry O, and Lord Hartington, later known as Hart. And by his mistress and second wife, the Lady Elizabeth Foster, 2 children, Augustus Clifford and Caroline St. Jules, later the wife of George Lamb, politician and writer. Caro would use the name of her brother Augustus for the name of her own son. During childhood, Caro became particularly close to Lady Harriet, who was only 3 months older than her. Her behavior grew increasingly troublesome to her family. She experimented with sedatives like laudanum when provided to them and had a special governess to control her. Lady Sidney Morgan reported in her memoirs that Lady Caroline told her that she had grown up as a tomboy and was quite unable to read or write until adolescence. As a child, Lady Caroline considered being able to wash a dog one of her most satisfying accomplishments. The grandmother she shared with her Cavendish cousins, the formidable Dowager Lady Spencer, was zealously dedicated to promoting education, and later employed their governess as her own personal companion. This governess was Miss Selina Trimmer, daughter of Mrs. Sarah Trimmer, a well-known and respected author of moral tales for children. She taught them an extensive curriculum considerably beyond mere literacy. There is a published letter Caro wrote in October 1796, just before her 11th birthday, that not only demonstrates her literacy, but shows a merciless wit and talent for mimicry. Despite this, Caro was often punished by being denied education at home for her outbursts, and so she would report to others that she was not literate until later in life. Caro also attended a school in Hansbridge, Knightsbridge, London, the successor to the Reading Abbey Girls' School, where she was taught by Frances Arabella Roden. Roden published many books, and she was not only a published poet, but according to another pupil, Mary Russell Mitford, she had a knack of making poetesses of her pupils. In her early adult years, Lady Caroline not only wrote prose and poetry, but also took to sketching. These courtly skills were important to her and her family. She spoke French and Italian fluently, was skilled at Greek and Latin, and also enjoyed music and drama. Despite this, she remained sickly and was always very thin and pale throughout her life. In June 1805, at the age of 19, Lady Caroline Ponsonby married the Honourable William Lamb, an up-and-coming politician and heir to the first Viscount Melbourne. Although their meeting had been shrewdly orchestrated by William Lamb's mother, who was a tireless political mover, theirs was a love match. The couple had become mutually captivated with each other during a visit to Brocket Hall in 1802, and for many years the pair enjoyed a happy marriage. Caro, when she married the Honourable William Lamb, was very sheltered, and her childlike nature was very attractive to him. They were very young together, and early reminiscences of them have them playing hide and seek in Brocket Hall together, and so marriage for Caro was somewhat of a shock. She had never been away from all of her brothers and sisters before for such an extended period of time, and on her honeymoon she was reported as looking very sickly. Caroline gave birth to a stillborn child in January 1806, and then she and William produced a son, George Augustus Frederick, in August 1807. Augustus was mentally impaired, and he would require around-the-clock care for the rest of his life. They also had a premature daughter, born in 1809, who died within 24 hours and is buried in the same cemetery as Caro herself, which is in Hatfield and is St. Etheldreda's Church. Caro was physically ill-suited to childbirth, and she suffered long recovery periods after each one. She would have to take bathing cures, she would have to rest in bed, and this could clash with her naturally rambunctious nature. Like I said, Augustus was born with severe mental problems. Although most aristocratic families typically sent such relatives to institutions, the Lambs cared for their son at home until his eventual death in 1836, 8 years after Caro's death. The stress of their son's ill health, combined with William Lamb's consuming career ambitions, drove a wedge between the couple. William Lamb was away from home a lot of the time. He would have to travel up to Ireland, and so Caro was left by herself, and this was very difficult for her. A further difficulty was that William's brothers and sister, a very close-knit and political and shrewd Melbourne clan, all detested Caroline, whom they called the Little Beast, while she and her mother-in-law hated each other from the start, and this lifelong enmity was to be a great cause of unhappiness to Caroline, who never figured out how to get along with them. Her diagnosis from childhood from Dr. Warren was that Lamb's brain was too fertile and too agile, undoubtedly gifted and even brilliant, but she should be encouraged to play more and use her brain less. Stating that there was no evidence of insanity, Dr. Warren prescribed that she should not be taught anything or placed under any kind of restraint. The symptoms of excitability and wild intelligence that caused Dr. Warren to be summoned in her youth, from which he did not diagnose insanity yet prescribed uneducated and unrestricted freedom within the already liberal environment, allowed Lamb's childhood propensity to be outspoken and demonstrative to develop into the woman who defied conventions for acceptable feminine behavior. Today, Lamb is condemned as a crazy ex-girlfriend, hysteric for being expressive, and self-expression is seen as a symptom of hysteria. But Lamb was never diagnosed as being either hysterical or insane by many examining doctors. Her family was very concerned about her. There were doctors in and out of the home, and none of them ever suggested that Caro should be locked up anywhere. The loudest declarations of Lamb's madness would persistently emanate from women Lamb had once called friends. Lady Holland observed in a letter that the physicians will not sign to her being mad enough to be confined. They say she is only wicked from temper and brandy. But then she was swift to condemn Lamb as being inherently deranged. One has to remember that Lamb had no problem satirizing her friends and publishing these in her various books, and so her friends were not always happy with Caro. Caro herself noticed her outsider status, writing in her diary, "My mother, having boys, wished ardently for a girl, and I, who evidently ought to have been a soldier, was found a naughty girl, forward talking like Richard III." That Lamb's behavior was cause for concern because she was a naughty girl is nowhere better illustrated than by a comparison with her brother, William. This brother was closest to Lamb in temperament as well as age. Both were described as lively, exuberant, curious, and eccentric children. But Willie's chatter and comments amused his family and friends, and he is described as quite well, despite displaying the temper when tired. Whereas Lamb, who said anything that came into her head, caused distress and embarrassment to her family, and her temper was a portent for disaster in later life. The question of genetic bipolar disorder or mania has been raised due to Caro's potential paternity from Richard Brinsley Butler Sheridan, who was born in 1751 and died in poverty in 1816. Sheridan was an Irish satirist, politician, working for the Navy, playwright, poet, and long-term owner of the London Theatre Royal at Drury Lane. He is known for his plays such as The Rivals, The School for Scandal, and A Trip to Scarborough. He was a Whig MP for 32 years in the British House of Commons, and he is buried at Poets' Corner. His plays remain an essential part of the British canon and are regularly performed worldwide. In 1772, aged 20 or 21, Sheridan fought 2 duels with Captain Thomas Matthews, who had written in a newspaper article defaming the character of Elizabeth Ann Linley, whom Sheridan intended to marry. In the first duel, they agreed to fight in Hyde Park, but it was too crowded. So they went to the Hercules Pillars Tavern, and then on to Castle Tavern in Covent Garden. The duel was short and bloodless. Matthews lost his sword and was forced to beg for his life. The apology was made public, and Matthews, infuriated by the publicity the duel had received, refused to accept his defeat and challenged Sheridan to another duel. Sheridan was not obliged to accept this challenge, but could have been a social pariah if he had not. The second duel was fought in July 1772 at Kingsdown near Bath. This time, both men broke their swords, but carried on fighting in a desperate struggle for life and honor. Both were wounded, Sheridan dangerously, and he had to be borne from the field with a portion of the weapon sticking through an ear. His breastbone was touched, and his whole body was covered with blood, and his face was nearly beaten to jelly with the hilt of Matthew's sword. Matthew escaped in a post-haste. 8 days after this affair, Sheridan was out of danger and well again. Later that year, Elizabeth and the 21-year-old Richard eloped and set up house in London on a lavish scale. He had no money, but lived off of his wife's dowry. When he enters the narrative with Caro, he is living with a woman named Hecca, and I don't know if this was one of his actresses whom he frequently made mistresses of, but he did have an affair with Caro's mother, Lady Bessborough. And he had an affair with her the year that Caro would have been conceived. So when Caro delivered Augustus, the Prince of Wales would stand as the child's godfather. Her cousin Harriet described her as having grown very thin, and Lady Bessborough and Caro did everything they could to prevent Sheridan from attending baby Augustus's christening for some reason. But the ingenious Sheridan got the Prince of Wales to designate him as his attendant for the day. At the ensuing party, Sheridan recited impromptu verses on the new baby, causing Caro to get up and abruptly leave the room in which was sitting the Prince of Wales himself. This was incredibly rude, and so one has to wonder what Caro knew about Sheridan that she was so upset about this. Had her mother warned her that Sheridan was actually her father? This would have been really shocking, in part due to Sheridan's heritage. He was related to the royal family directly, but he wasn't a nobleman, and this would have been very offensive to Caro to know. In addition, Sheridan had a lot of issues. Like I said before, he was this dashing man fighting duels in public, but he also struggled with a lot of mental illness. Sheridan's behavior stemmed partly from his alcoholism. He pursued Lady Bessborough into the nursery where she was attending Augustus alone, waiting for the return of Caro and the nurse. In an attempt to staunch the flow of his monologue, she held up the child and asked him whether his grandchildren were as pretty as hers. The effect upon Sheridan was drastic. Maybe this was his grandchild. He vowed to take vengeance, cursed her, and ordered his carriage. As he was leaving, he grabbed her violently, gripping her hand so powerfully that she was left with bruises, swelling, and a badly cut ring finger. His reaction suggested that he believed her reference to grandchildren was meant to wound him, but why would it, unless he believed Augustus to be a grandchild of his own? Sheridan died in miserable circumstances in 1816. Lady Bessborough visited him as he lay on his deathbed, her once lover, and she later told Lord Brockton that he had frightened her by saying he would come to her after he had died. She protested that he had persecuted her all his life. Why would he wish to prolong the prosecution beyond the grave? His answer echoed Hamlet's father's ghosts, "Because I am resolved you shall remember me." Samuel Rogers reported that shortly before he died, Sheridan said, "Tell Lady Bessborough that my eyes will look up to the coffin lid as brightly as ever." It's hard to know what to make of Sheridan's volatile relationship with Caro's mother. It's also difficult to say what Lady Bessborough herself may have believed. She may have been uncertain who Caro's father was. She may have believed the father was her husband. Or she may have known Sheridan was the father, but preferred not to put it about. If Sheridan thought he was Caro's father, Lady Bessborough, to our knowledge, was either unable or unwilling to persuade him otherwise. His compulsive jealousy and violent nature would have driven her to protect Caro, who was very sensitive and of ill health for most of her life, in any way necessary. It is possible that Sheridan's manic-depressive personality lies at the root of Caro's own mental difficulties. However she came by them, many believe she was afflicted. There is mounting proof of the connection between epilepsy and manic depression as well. Augustus, Caro's son, was afflicted with severe epilepsy. Her manic-depressive tendencies were exacerbated by pregnancy and morning sickness. One has to remember that insanity was defined differently then as it is today. There was a type of insanity called moral insanity, and this was defined as a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, and natural impulses, without any remarkable disorder or defect of the intellect, or knowing and reasoning faculties, and particularly without any insane illusion or hallucination. As a 19th century woman and an aristocrat, Lamb becomes a primary candidate as a sufferer of mental illness according to contemporary diagnosis. Women of a leisured class, being used to commodities, luxuries, and indulgences, were thought to be open to fluctuations of desires and impulses, as opposed to women of a laboring class, who were thought to be immune to hysteria because of the hardness and discipline of their daily routine. The images of disorder in mind and body that Lamb appears to personify represent a dramatization of a loss of the self-control that was so despised by the epitome of adulterous discretion, Lamb's mother-in-law, Lady Melbourne, or the Viscountess Melbourne. This mother-in-law had so many affairs, even purportedly one with Lord Byron himself. In a much-quoted letter, she declared that when anyone braves the opinion of the world, sooner or later they will feel the consequences of it. Lamb, in direct contrast to her mother-in-law, openly professed her love for another man. Lady Melbourne would do it in private. Burned effigies of Lord Byron while reading a rite of exorcism. She wrote a novel based upon her adulterous affair, and she had impersonated Byron in a letter to his publishers in order to have them send her a portrait. The tone and substance of her request fooled them into sending the painting. Her marriage was falling apart after the death of her children and her illness and her departure from her family and the departure of her husband from home. And so Lamb flung herself into the customs of the day, which included extramarital affairs for the aristocracy. And in 1810, she had a liaison with Sir Godfrey Webster, and this enraged her mother-in-law because it damaged relations between William Lamb and Sir Godfrey's stepfather, Lord Holland, who was the head of the Whig Party. So we see her mother-in-law lecturing Caro and telling her to be careful about her affair picks, not telling her, hey, be loyal to my son, just saying, hey, you need to be careful about who you pick. At this point, a lot of people around Caro, including her husband's family, wanted to show her having the moral insanity. And so She is depicted in many letters and journals and reports as having a nervous temperament, violent and unstable emotions, depression, excitement, poor attention span, disturbed intellect, disturbed will, deficient judgment, dependency, immaturity, egocentricity, being attention-seeking. For example, one time she jumped over a couch at a party. Deceitfulness, being theatrical, fearful, and irritable. The primary tactic of the campaign to have Lamb certified, led by her sister-in-law, Lady Cowper, who took up the mantle after her mother-in-law's death, was that all Caroline's eccentricities and lighthearted pranks in the past were now being carefully collated for future use. So one can imagine the paranoia this would strike at Caro. She was a very literary person. She wrote many letters, she had diaries, and so the knowledge that her own family were collecting all of these accounts about her to hopefully get her sent away was very hard, and it definitely had an impact on her. A lot of the accounts describe her wit, vitality, inventiveness, and generosity, but this Lady Caroline Lamb is swiftly crushed under the weight of evidence of her mood swings. She would throw plates and cups at her husband, for example, but then the account ends that they're both to blame. Extravagant and extrovert behavior, undisciplined and wild intelligence, which significantly is the sum of evidence against her. Lamb, at the heart of a fashionable society that she had already described as a vacuum as early as 1811, was deprived of any real vocation. As early as 1811, Lamb addressed a poem to Lord Holland which contained the lines, "By heavens, I'm sick of dissipation and want some serious occupation." In December 1817, during a period of recuperation after a fall from her horse and a subsequent fever, Lamb wrote the following letter to Lady Morgan. "For 1 week I never swallowed anything. The moment of danger passed, and now I believe in truth I died. For assuredly a new Lady Caroline has arisen from this death. I seem to have buried my sins, griefs, melancholy, now, and to come out like a newborn babe, unable to walk, think, and speak, but perfectly happy. My mind is calm. I am pleased to be alive, grateful for the kindness shown me, and never mean to answer questions further back than the 15th of this month, that being the day of this new Lady Caroline's birth. And I hate the old one. She had her good qualities, but she had grown into a sort of female Timon, not of Athens, bitter, and always going over old past scenes. She also imagined people hated her. Now the present Lady Caroline is as gay as a lark, sees all as it should be, but at present, like her predecessors and like one of your countrymen, is going about wanting work. I have nothing to do. I know I might and ought to do a great many things, but then I am not compelled to do them. As to writing, assuredly, enough has been written. Besides, it is different when one's thoughts flow out before one's pen, and writing with one's pen waiting for thoughts. Would I could be useful." The desire and need for a meaningful occupation is the theme of the 2 published works that came after this letter, Graham Hamilton and Ada Rice. Lady Orville laments her lack of practical skills to Graham Hamilton in Caro's novel, saying, "You once told me that existence was dead without active pursuits, and that action was the light of life. I cannot labor. Write I do, but were I to publish, I would only make enemies or incur censure." In the introduction of Caro's other novel, Ada Rice, this theme of usefulness is reiterated. The moral of the tale appears to be that he who remains amidst the busy scenes of life, himself without employment, is in constant danger of becoming prey of wicked feelings and corrupt passions. For as use preserves iron from rust, so labor and exertion purify and invigorate the soul. It was because of Byron that Lamb discovered the mind-saving role of writing as therapy. He described this in volcanic terms as the lava of the imagination whose eruption prevents an earthquake, that I cannot help thinking rhyme is so far useful in anticipating and preventing the disorder. Byron was very concerned about Caroline Lamb's health, and after they broke up, he stated that a skeleton haunts me in relation to how thin she was. From March to August 1812, Lady Caroline embarked on a well-publicized affair with Lord Byron. He was 24 and she was 27. She had spurned the attention of the poet on their first meeting, subsequently giving Byron what became his lasting epitaph when she described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. His response was to pursue her passionately. He followed her after she commented on his poetry to her house and demanded to be let in, and then proclaimed undying love to her. They publicly decried each other as they privately pledged their love over the following months. So we see them trying to abide by the strange moral code of the time. He referred to Lamb by the name Caro, and after Byron broke things off after about 6 months, her husband, William Lamb, took the disgraced and desolate Lady Caroline to Ireland. This distance did not cool Lady Caroline's interest in the poet. Maybe she was thinking about her potential father figure, Sheridan, who was a playwright in Ireland. He was Irish. She and Byron corresponded constantly during her exile. The amount of letters she sent to Byron actually irritated him. When Caro returned to London in 1813, Byron made it clear he had no intention of restarting their relationship, and he actually sent her a letter stamped with the mark of his latest lover, Lady Oxford, who was 17 years his senior. Lady Caroline's obsession with Byron would define much of her later life and influence both her and Byron's works. They wrote poems in the style of each other, about each other, and even embedded overt messages to one another in their verse. I don't think anyone has found all of these overt messages. There's a lot of them, and I think they keep on coming up. After a thwarted visit to Byron's home, Caro wrote "Remember Me" into the flyleaf of one of Byron's books. He responded with the hate poem, remember thee, till leth quench life's burning stream, remorse and shame shall cling to thee, and haunt thee like a feverish dream. Remember thee, doubt it not, thy husband too shall think of thee, by neither shalt thou be forgot, thou false to him, thou fiend to me. Her cousin Harriet, by then Lady Granville, with whom Caro's relationship had deteriorated after childhood, visited her in December 1816. She was so incredulous at her unrepentant behavior over Lord Byron that she ended her description of the visit in a letter to her sister with, "I mean my visit to be annual." Harriet, who became Lady Granville, married one of her aunt's lovers. So Harriet's reaction to romantic affairs was very different than Caro's. Lamb's most famous work is Glenarvon, a Gothic novel that was released in 1816, just weeks after Byron's departure from England, due to his banishment, essentially. Although published anonymously, Lamb's authorship was an open secret. It featured a thinly disguised pen picture of herself and her former lover, who was painted as a war hero who turns traitor against the cause of Ireland. The book was notable for featuring the first version of the Byronic hero outside of Byron's own work and life, and detailed scrutiny of the Romantic period. Lamb included scathing caricatures of several members of prominent society members, which we rely on today. One of them, Lady Jersey, canceled Lamb's vouchers to the popular club Almack's in retribution for the Lamb's characterizations. This was the opening salvo in a backlash that found Lamb blackballed from fashionable society. Byron responded to the novel, "I read Glenarvon 2 by Caro Lamb, goddamn." The book was a financial success that sold out several editions but was dismissed by critics as pulp fiction. However, later scholars, like the philosopher Goethe, deemed it worthy of serious literary consideration. What Glenarvon is a book that is characterized by mental illness, and whether Caro meant to do it purposefully or not, it has a very manic tone, lighthearted in some parts and then descending into really dark themes. And so it's not known if Caro did this purposefully. She was very tricky, and she would put little jokes in her letters and pretend to be something that she wasn't. She would dress up as men, for example. And so it's an interesting example of this sort of manic novel. She used her skill to respond to Byron's Don Juan 1 and 2. Lamb was very concerned about allusions Byron had made about her. For example, the line, "Some play the devil and then write a novel," from Don Juan II is believed to be about Caro. In a new canto, Lamb wrote, as Byron, "I'm sick of fame, I'm gorged with it, so full I could almost regret the happier hour when northern oracles proclaimed me dull." Byron never publicly responded to this poem. A reviewer of the time opined, "The writer of this lively nonsense has evidently intended it as an imitation of Lord Byron. It is a rhapsody from beginning to end." Lamb did suffer as a result of her treatment by Byron, but in terms of betrayal, humiliation, and justifiable anger instead of mental collapse. As the Byron affair came to an end, in an 1812-1813 letter to Lord Clare, Caro wrote that she had been so ill that I can only thank God I am again in my senses. She writes on the sense of humiliation she felt because friends she had behaved most ill to should now be kind, and that the one I sacrificed so much for should thus treat me this way. It's not known the promises Byron made her. Byron certainly made a lot of different promises to a lot of different women and would renege on a lot of them. So Caro, in her innocence and childlike nature, may have believed him. During the period of literary production that saw Glenarvon, a new canto, Gordon, a tale, Graham Hamilton, and Ada Rice published, a further 4 novels were being revised in 1822, but having been started much earlier. These were Rosamond, Penruddock, Rose and Mary, and Sir Eustace de Grey, and an outline for her novelization of the drama The Witch of Edmonton that she began in 1823. The lack of academic curiosity that these works arouse is indicative of how little consequence Caro's intellectual efforts are to the main thrust of her narrative that says she's constantly mentally disintegrating. Lamb is quoted as saying in 1816 that for 3 years she had worshipped him, thereby recognizing that her crush period was finite, belonging to the past, and that the end of the affair would be a cathartic moment for Lamb in terms of intellectual activity, contradicting the post-Byronic stasis that she is described as inhabiting by her biographers. Many of her biographers envision Lamb as occupying a post-Byronic hinterland, literally a no-man's land, that had been rendered meaningless by the absence of Byron. Many of them use the same evocative image of her wrapped in shawls, gazing at a chair in which Byron allegedly sat to have his portrait painted. The source of this is Lady Morgan, who is describing her visit to Lamb, who was suffering from an illness and apparently in a reflective mood and staring around the room. Language gave Lamb a tool with which to negotiate a place to be heard. As Lamb said in a poem addressed to Harriet Wilson when she was threatening to reveal the details of her liaisons, in which Lamb's brother-in-law, Frederick Lamb, was implicated, Harriet Wilson, "Shall I tell thee where, besides me being cleverer, we differ? Thou wert hired to hold thy tongue. Thou hast no right to do thy lovers wrong. But I, whom none could buy or gain, who am as proud, girl, as thyself art vain, and like thyself, or sooner like the wind, blow raging ever free and unconfined. What should hold my tongue with pen of steel? The faults of those who have wronged me reveal. Why should I hide men's follies, while my own blaze like gas along this talking town? Is it being bitter to be too sincere? Must we adulterate the truth as they do beer? I'll tell thee why that, as each has a price, I have been bought at last. I am not ice. Kindness and gratitude have chained my tongue. From henceforth I will do no mortal wrong. Prate those who please, laugh, censure who that will. My mouth is sealed, my thoughts, my pen are still. In the meantime, we lambs are seldom civil. I wish thy book, not thee, at the devil." Indeed, Lamb wrote that as to any promises I may have been forced to make, not to obstruct the impending separation from William, when a strait waistcoat and a mad doctor are held forth to view, they cannot expect that I should think them binding. Lamb knew the end of her marriage was upon her, and she asked her husband to a formal separation in 1825. Both parties had had numerous extramarital affairs by that time, and Lamb was not a fan of duplicity. She took up permanent residence at Brocket Hall, where some believe she's a ghost there, and supposedly you can hear her harpsichord playing. Lamb's struggle with mental instability became more pronounced in her later years, complicated by her abuse of alcohol and laudanum. I've read some accounts that said she was missing her front teeth, and there's an account of her in this white dressing gown looking for alcohol in this Brocket Hall room, and it's very sad. It's very sad that she really was an addict in her later years. By 1827, she was under the care of a full-time physician as her body, which had always been frail, began to shut down. Her ex-husband, William Lamb, was Chief Secretary for Ireland by that time and made a perilous crossing to be by her side when she died on January 25th, 1828. She was in her early 40s. Her husband, William Lamb, continued to care for their son, Augustus. He definitely did not neglect his duties, and he became a really remarkable prime minister under Queen Victoria. For Caro, we remember her in many different ways. I am not aware of any really in-depth dive to Caro and who she was. She's always depicted as this side character to Lord Byron, and I don't think that that is a worthwhile ending for her. I think that she was a very full, interesting person, and there are so many mysteries around Caroline Lamb. For example, she supposedly wore these Ponsonby family amethysts at her wedding, and I've never been able to find a record of them before or since. So did she sell these amethysts to buy laudanum? It's just not known. So there are many mysteries with Caro, but I hope you enjoyed this video.